Amen. Good morning. Today we crossed the Red Sea. I'm sure you're all happy to hear that. One of the greatest miraculous spectacles of all time. Miracles there are many in the Bible, but very few as big and as spectacular as this. It is constantly referred back to throughout the Bible. The whole story of the Red Sea is sometimes alluded to, sometimes directly referred to. And it's the whole story pretty much is in chapter 14. So I would really appreciate if you had your Bibles and that you were looking at chapter 14, because I'll be jumping around through several verses and showing how they relate to one another in some interesting ways. Let's set the stage again for where we were last time. This is the road that Moses traveled when he went to Midian. Remember, he left Egypt. He was fleeing for his life, and he tended sheep in northwest Arabia for 40 years. And it was on a mountain in northwest Arabia. We refer to it as Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb or the Mountain of God. And that is where Moses met God at the burning bush, and God told him to go back and take the people out of Egypt in accordance with his promises. And he went back on this same exact road. It's a long-standing trading route from Egypt all the way down into Arabia. It was used by the incense and perfume trade. It's called the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. The Red Sea divides into two gulfs and creates this triangle that we call today the Sinai Peninsula. And it was relatively unpopulated. It was frontier in those days. There was a lot of mining operations. It didn't belong to any one country, but it was under the protection of Pharaoh in Egypt. And so by leaving Sukkot, where they marshaled together and formed up as a column, Israel was not safe from Pharaoh. And so there was a great urgency to get across the desert. They had to get away from Pharaoh's control. And the only way to do that was to cross the Great Rift Valley, as you can see right here at the city of Eilat. There still is a city there. It's called Eilat. It's a resort town in Israel. And as soon as they crossed that valley, they would be out of Pharaoh's reach and out of his control. So you can imagine that they wanted to get across here as fast as they possibly could. Now, they weren't going to the Promised Land. They were going to Mount Sinai. It's because when Moses spoke to God at the burning bush, God said, when you are taken out of Egypt, you come to this mountain and worship me here. You know, that principle is general. Before we can go to the Promised Land, we first have to straighten out our relationship with God. That's true all the way through the Bible and all the way through history. But it's a good plan. Moses knew what he was doing. He knew where he was going. He'd been on this road now enough times. And this was a well-traveled road. They knew what to expect. They could plan for it. And I'm sure that they made a lot of plans, because this would have to be a forced march. The fact that there was a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night tells us that they were marching day and night. And you can understand that. These are slaves that are now free. They had to get out of Pharaoh's reach. He had changed his mind enough times before that they knew exactly what the threat was from him. And so they were pushing as fast as they possibly could go. The trip is about 150 miles to get to Eilat. And if you figure they're going day and night, they're pushing, they're driving their animals just to use up their body weight rather than feed them, and carrying what little water they had, which wouldn't last for very long, they probably spent anywhere from 5 to 6 days or a week crossing to get to Eilat and to the tip of the Gulf. Now, as we saw last week, just when they got close to freedom, they were right there by Eilat. God throws a wrench into their plans. And in 14:1 and 2, God tells Moses to turn back. Now, of all the crazy things to do, with all that you've done to free the people from Israel, all the incredible hardship of making this forced march all the way across the desert, and now we're on the very brink of salvation, and God says, turn back. That did not make any sense, especially to Moses, who was a military man. And he says this, God says, turn back and encamp near Pi Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. and they are to encamp by the sea, directly opposite Baal Zephon. Now, we could assume that Moses knew where these places were. We do not. He certainly knew where Baal Zephon was, since that was in Midian. Those were his stomping grounds. But in any case, they had to go to a place where they could camp by the water. And there's really only one place. And so he would have to turn to the south and go into the mountains and the gullies and the wadis to get to a beach called, today, it's called Nuweiba Beach in Arabic. Now you can see it in the left here on a satellite view of the Gulf. Right here, it's pretty obvious. It sticks out real clear. And it's a big beach that's about 4 square miles. And it can be accessed through this little road of gullies and so forth. What I've done here on the right is take from that verse and get an idea of what the geographic layout of these 3 places was, even though we don't know where they were for precisely. The word Migdal means fortress, and so this could have been an old fort, could have been a small garrison of Egyptians that were guarding the mines and so forth, and it was back away from the water. Pi-hahiroth was apparently on the beach, and it would have been a small fishing camp or something like that where fishermen would use to launch out into the water. Baal Zephon, on the other hand, would be across on the other side, would be a village, more than likely, of Midianites. And so they were to go to camp by the sea next to Pi-hahiroth between Migdal and Baal Zephon. And that's where they were. That's where we left them. If you recall, in order to get there, this beach, which is completely enclosed by steep mountains and inaccessible in any other way, you had to go into this huge network of gullies and ravines and dry riverbeds and access the beach through this dry riverbed right here called the Wadi Watir. Now, that's where we left them last week. That's where they were camped. And you can imagine, you got 1.5 million people, and they're camped on 4 square miles, which is enough room, plenty room. They're camped by the water in sort of a tent city. I certainly believe that they would have known Pharaoh was on his way. Moses knew how to send out scouts and find out what was going on and gather intelligence. And then all of a sudden it says in chapter 4, verses 9 to 10, the Pharaoh and the Egyptians have arrived. Go ahead, John, would you read that for us?
Yeah. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth, opposite Baal Zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord.
Okay, it says that Pharaoh catches up, or he overtakes them. So in other words, they were on the beach and they were in camp. They had set up their camp, and they were trying to figure out what happens now. And I can imagine that the unrest was growing. But now Pharaoh's army comes out of this wadi and starts pouring onto the beach in full view of them. They looked up, it says, and they see Pharaoh in his army, and he's beginning to set up his camp, set up his headquarters, and then arrange the battle line. In those days, before you went to battle, you arrayed your army in one big long line. Normally, the archers were on the ends and the sling throwers and things, and then you'd have the infantry, and then you'd have the cavalry, which would be normally chariots, the Abrams tank of that day. And so they were doing this, and it was not to be a battle, it was to be a slaughter. The Israelites, were unarmed. They didn't have anything but a few clubs and, staffs and things like that, things that they might use for farming. So there's no battle. They were unarmed. They were about to be totally slaughtered. And I take it that the Pharaoh was in no hurry. Why would he hurry? He commanded the only exit. There was no other way out. These folks were at his mercy. So I imagine he set up his camp. He probably expected to start the killing the next day. I think he probably did everything he could for effect to sow terror among the people. He even may have sent propaganda messages into the camp to tell people what tortures and what horrible things awaited them in the next morning when they were going to attack. And I think Pharaoh's no dummy. He's a military man, and he would have sent an ultimatum to Israel's leaders, to Moses and the tribal leaders, and he probably would have offered them terms of surrender. And I would think that that term of surrender would also include a general amnesty. In other words, he's going to say, look, there's no place for you to go. You're all going to die unless you surrender. Why don't you surrender? I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you amnesty, and you can all come back and go back to the life you had before. You can keep your homes. You can keep your job. You can continue to work for the great Pharaoh. The only people that don't get amnesty are Moses and the tribal leaders. They're going to be tortured to death at the pleasure of the Pharaoh. That's probably what he told them. And this was racing throughout the camp and causing chaos. Imagine you're ordered by tribes and by clans within those tribes and then by families. and they were begging their local congressmen, so to speak, to surrender. Look, this is it. It's over. It was a nice idea. You've got to surrender. My family and I don't want to die. And I just don't know if it's possible. I've tried all week to put myself in their position and imagine the terror and the fear that was just rampant among them. Now, Moses would have governed through a tribal council of some sort of a Sanhedrin or a Congress of some sort. And so they must have been, the leaders must have put tremendous pressure on Moses to capitulate. Look, why don't we go back? And it says here later on, it'll say that he blamed Moses and say, look, let's just go back. Why don't we just go back to Egypt where we have been? And they've done this many times over the next 40 years, always saying, why don't we go back to Egypt? So I'm sure he was in a terrible situation. He is trying to keep a lid on an explosive situation, especially within the ruling council. And I think that a good number of the people were thinking, look, we need to kill Moses, put his head on a pike, and march over to the Pharaoh and give it to him and say, we give up. And then we all go back home, and we can all live again the way we've been living for all these years. And I think that the only thing that kept them from revolt at that time was probably what they had seen of God's power acting through Moses, and they were afraid of him to some degree. They didn't want to mess with Moses because of God's power. And probably there's a supernatural power at work here as well. People would not advance against him. So try and imagine they bring together an emergency council of the tribal heads and the clan heads, and they're bustling about maybe in a giant tent or else just out in the open air, and aides are coming and going with messages, and people are getting speeches and passionately advocating, and probably most of them are advocating to give up. And they had to come to a response. And at the end of this period of commotion, Moses rises up with all his stature, all his importance. He was kind of like George Washington at the Continental Congress. He was the guy that people listened when he talked. And so he stands up and he addresses the assembly in one of the most immortal verses in the Bible. In Exodus 14, 13 and 14, you can hear what he said. John?
Moses answered the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still.
Now, notice he doesn't tell them how the Lord will fight for them. He doesn't tell them how the Egyptians will go away. I mean, they might have thought he's going to send fire from heaven like he did on Sodom and Gomorrah. Maybe that's what he'll do. Others will say, don't kid yourself. The cavalry's not coming. He's not coming over the hill. He says, don't be afraid. Stand firm. Stop running around and being crazy. Settle out. The Lord will fight for you. And he wins the day. And so they send a response back to the Pharaoh saying, no, I can't help but think of the response that General Tony McAuliffe gave to the Germans in the Battle of Bastogne in 1944. They sent him this 2-page long letter telling him it was time that he surrendered. He was totally surrounded. The artillery was preparing to bombard the city into smithereens. And, would he just acknowledge the surrender and they would take him prisoner? And McAuliffe sent back a reply They wanted a formal reply, so he had it all typed up, and it had one word on it, and that word was nuts. And the Germans couldn't understand. So I imagine Moses sends back his version of nuts to the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh says, oh, wow, all right, I guess we'll have to move in tomorrow. Now, Moses doesn't really know how God's going to deliver them, right? He urges everybody, trust that he will deliver you anyway. God has made promises. He will keep them. I know it doesn't look good, but you can trust God. Isn't that what the whole idea of faith is all about? We trust God even though things may look differently or things may look impossible. I also think that Moses was not as confident as he sounded when he spoke to the assembly. Why do I think that? Well, in the next verse we're going to read, God says to him, why are you crying out to me? Well, that means that he was crying out in prayer to God. So I think that after he made this great speech of confidence in God and having faith, Moses goes back to his tent and he's not so sure. So he's fallen on his face. He's saying, God, you got to do something like right now. Where are you? Why aren't you doing something? How can you allow this to happen? These people are going to be slaughtered. And I can just hear this going over and over in his mind, just as it would go over and over in your mind and mine when we get to one of these impossible places. Oh, God, where are you? Oh, Lord, what's the matter? How come you don't seem to care? I don't think he had as much confidence privately as he showed publicly. And so he goes back and he is crying out to God in prayer. And finally, then God answers him. Chapter 14, we're to verses 15 to 16.
Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground.
Now, God says, Moses, get up. Stop crying. What's the matter? Why don't you believe what I tell you? I've told you before what's going to happen. Now, just trust me and we're going to make this happen. Now, here's what you got to do. So he gives Moses now his next steps. He says, stretch out your staff, divide the water so that Israel can walk through. Oh, that's how you're going to do it. Nobody ever dreamed that the seas would part. That's just completely out of anybody's imagination. Makes you think of that verse in the New Testament that says, I have not seen nor ear heard, neither has it entered into the heart of man, the things that God has prepared for them that love him. And that's true. God's deliverance is oftentimes out of left field. We have no idea what he was going to do, and what an amazing thing it is when he steps in and does the unexpected. But also, he doesn't tell him everything. In verses 17 and 18, he goes on a little bit. You can read them for yourself. He talks about the Egyptians and how he will harden their hearts, and they will go in after the Israelites. And then God says, I will gain glory from my name through Pharaoh. He didn't tell him what he's going to do to him. All he tells Moses is, raise your arm. We're going to part the sea. Israel's going to walk through. And oh, by the way, the Pharaoh and his army will follow you. Well, that's not terribly comforting, but it's a start. And that's oftentimes how God leads you and me. He'll give you the next steps. And I think what we should do is pray, Lord, show me the next step. What is it that you want me to do today? What are you putting on my plate today? And then help me to be obedient in that and trust you for tomorrow. So he still doesn't tell him how he's going to gain glory from Pharaoh, but he will. Whoops, sorry, okay. And then we get the verses that are the money quotes, right? This is the account of what happened in 14:19 to 22. John?
Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long.
So the first thing that you see.
Then Moses stretched out. You want?
Oh, go ahead. Keep going. Sorry, I preempted you. Go ahead.
Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left.
Okay. Notice, first of all, that the angel of the Lord goes between Egypt and his people. Now, as you go through the Old Testament, the term the angel of the Lord, theologians mostly agree, conservative theologians agree, that this is an epiphany. It is a pre-incarnate appearance of God in the person of Jesus Christ, the second person of the Trinity. So what this is saying is that God the Son himself is with Israel, and he comes between Israel and her enemies. That's significant, isn't it? It should impress us that God always, when necessary, comes between us and his enemies, between his people and his enemies. The angel of the Lord will never leave you nor forsake you. That's echoed in the New Testament. Now, this cloud, this pillar, this strange thing that has been leading them across the desert now goes between them and the Egyptians. And what it does is it produces darkness on the Egyptians. I'm not totally sure whether this was just during the night hours or it was fog during the day, but it may well be like with the plagues that this was darkness. I mean, just pitch black darkness and fog. And so he envelops the Egyptian army in their camp as they're waiting for the morning when they're going to assault the Israelites and slaughter a vast number of them. They're stuck. They can't go anywhere. They're just completely immobilized. And if I were Pharaoh, I'd say, all right, you want to do that? That's fine. I can wait. I can wait you out. Y'all starve before I run out of supplies. I own the entrance to this beach. You've got no way off. So I don't think he was terribly worried. And it's important that you notice that there is, on the side of God's people, there is light. On the side of God's enemies, there's darkness. All through the Bible, particularly in the New Testament, you have verses like 1 Thessalonians 5, you are all children of the light, children of the day. We do not belong to the night or to the darkness. Those who belong to God, those who belong to Christ, the redeemed of God, are in the light. And it says, walk as children of light. And I think you notice it. I've seen this in my life. When I was younger, my folks would take us to see missionaries around the world. And I always noticed this, wherever the Church of Jesus Christ was, there was a brightness, there was a contentment. They may not have been rich, but they were well cared for. There was a regime of light. And I think you can tell that yourself when you see people, or if you in your life were converted at a later age, you could look back at your earlier life and say, that was a life of darkness, and I'm now living in light. Light belongs to God's people. Darkness belongs to his enemies. Now, by doing this, God gave his children space to get away. And so they stayed there paralyzed on the beach because they couldn't move anywhere, while meanwhile, Israel gets ready to evacuate and actually crosses. Another thing that's important in here, I want you to notice, is that he talks about, in verse 22, he says, and there was a wall of water. The Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and a wall of water on their left. Okay? Now, this idea of a wall of water is sort of like a knife cut through it, and there's just a vertical wall on either side. This isn't, we blew a little bit of the tide out and there was a sandbar that we could walk across. This is, it emphasizes that there's this vertical wall. And just from what we know of the underwater contours of the seabed at Nueva Beach, it's the only place where this would be a smooth walk going across. I think we talked about that last week. When you get to the middle, to the bottom, the lowest point in the sea bottom, that wall of water, which starts out at the shore, you know, just a few inches, then a few feet, and then a few tens of feet. By the time you get to the middle, it's 750 to 800 feet high. Now, just to give you a comparison, that would loom 1.5 times as tall as the National City Tower in Louisville. And it would appear to you, if you've been downtown on Main Street, back off of the National City Tower, about 2 blocks, which I think brings you to 3rd Street, and you look up, and that is how high the water would have appeared to you at the bottom of the sea. So as they're walking through this, it goes deeper, and the wall of water is higher and higher and higher, and it's truly an amazing situation. Now, it's hard to believe because we don't see that, right? But it is reaffirmed again and again in the Bible. We see it in 22 where it says there was a wall of water on their right and a wall of water on their left. Jump down to verse 29. And it says the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and a wall of water on their left. It says this in Exodus chapter 15, verse 8. John, have you got that?
Yeah. By the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The surging waters stood up like a wall, and the deep waters congealed in the heart of the sea.
How about Psalm 78, 13?
He divided the sea and led them through. He made the waters stand up like a wall.
So, you've got a lot of liberal theologians that want to say, well, this was a local little event where they were going through a marshy lake that, the wind happened along and it blew the water back a little bit and they went through ankle deep through the marsh. They're trying to make tame what nothing in the text here allows you to make tame. This is something unusual. It is absolutely unprecedented, and it is amazing. It is a mighty work of God. In other places in the Bible, in Isaiah and other books, they refer to this as the mighty waters, as the great deep. That's not some sandbar caused by a chance tidal surge. You're not walking ankle deep through this thing. You are walking through an increasingly high pair of walls, which up over your head would have looked terrifyingly high. Now, if you go through those verses we just read, you may be troubled a little bit, as I have been in the past. And this week, again, I've been kind of immersed in it. And you say, look, it seems as though this all happens in a few hours. I mean, it looks like they don't have enough time to get across. I mean, how do you get 1.5 million people across a 10-mile gap in just a matter of a couple hours? Now, part of this is because of the way the Bible tells stories. The Bible abbreviates stories. It only gives you, kind of like a rock skipping across the water, it gives you the key salient points. It doesn't lay it out in great detail, moment by moment on a timeline. And the problem that you have is that I'm teaching and I'm an engineer and I have to have that timeline. And it doesn't make sense to me until it adds up. And so for those of you guys who are inclined to that sort of thing, that you'll enjoy this. But those who aren't, I'm sorry. I've got to do it. It says the Egyptians were kept away by this cloud all night. That's verse 20. Then it says, verse 21, the wind blew over the water all night long. Okay, so we're not. And then it says in 24, during the last watch of the night, or the mid-watch, God threw the Egyptians into confusion. They're already down in the channel. Well, wait a minute. Where's the time for the Israelites to cross? How does that work? And I tell you, this is one of the great. This is why we meet, to study God's word. We don't just read it over. We don't just skip the details and say, oh, well, it probably makes sense somehow. We want to know that this is true, that when the Bible speaks, God speaks, and he speaks with infallible inerrancy. And so I did some study, and I worked on this thing and found that this thing really goes more like 2 days. And we'll see how that happened in just a moment. Let's just go through this. Bear with me, okay, all you non-engineer types. This will just make some calculations that helps us understand, okay? Now, we have to ask, how were they organized? In a column. And we know they were in a military column by their divisions. And how fast might they have proceeded, okay? Because that tells you how long it's going to take. So let's make some assumptions. You got 1.5 million people, and they're on foot, all right? And they're organized by divisions, like a military column. Let's make the gap between the walls of water a half mile. That's reasonable. Could have been a mile, but let's say it's a half mile. That's 2,500 feet roughly, okay? So let's organize the people into blocks like this one right here of 100,000 people on foot. Now just imagine, for spacing, they're in rows, And in the rows, the people are separated by approximately 5 feet. So you're walking, and your nearest neighbor on the right is 5 feet away, and on the left is 5 feet away. And then we'll let the rows be spaced out at 10 feet. So your nearest neighbor in front of you is 10 feet, and behind you is 10 feet. That's plenty of room. Now, everybody's going to mill around in a gaggle, but nonetheless, that's plenty of room for 100,000 people. And that would make the block approximately 2,000 feet by 2,500 feet wide. So it's 2,000 feet long, it's 20 rows, and in 2,500 feet wide, 500 men in the spacing. All right, so there's 100,000 people in a block. Now, to get 1.5 million people, you're going to need 15 blocks. It's just math, okay? So we got 15 blocks all lined up like this, okay? And then we're going to add 5 more blocks, because you have to have blocks for the livestock and for the cartage that they had, any carts and horses or anything they had that would be bringing supplies, such as water, or places where children could rest or something like that. And we're going to assume that each one of the tribes had to provide personnel to take care of these animals at the back and the carts and so forth. That would make sense to me. You know, Moses was a military guy. This is how you ran a caravan of soldiers. And of course, it makes sense that the animals would be at the back. You don't want them in the front, because you don't want the people to walk over what the animals leave behind. So we're going to say I got 15 blocks of 100,000, and then I got 5 more blocks of carts and of animals. Okay? And that's how, so that means that the column, now we know how long the column would be 8 miles long. There's 1.5 million people, their animals, their supplies, 8 miles long. Okay? Not terribly impossible. Now, how fast would they move? Let's just assume they can move at 1 mile per hour. As we saw last week, the underwater topography is about a 4% grade down and a 2% grade up. The Americans for Disabilities Act allows for 8% grade for handicapped people. So this is not an impossible grade. And it's interesting that the first part of the journey down is 4%, is much steeper than the way coming up, 2%. So it's pretty shallow trip. And it lasts about 10 miles. Now, because it's 10 miles long, it would take 8 hours for this 8-mile long caravan to pass the starting gate. So the first guy crosses, 8 hours later, the last guy crosses, okay? Well, then you got 10 miles to go. That's another 10 hours. So it's going to take 18 hours to get the Israelites from the beach at Nueva over to Baal Zephon. Okay? Now, how does this passage of the scripture affect and fit with that kind of logistics? Okay. I went ahead and sent with the invitation to you this slide, so you could blow it up if you want. I'm not asking you to read it on the screen, but I will take you through it. But this is my idea of how this could reasonably happen. It works with the text. It doesn't violate the text in any way. And then it also allows for this 18 hours to happen. It gives you some insight as to what happened. And I find that to be fascinating. So let's look at this. And the first thing I want you to notice, go back to your Bibles, and there are a number of thens, okay? In verse 19, start with 15. It says, then, this is after Moses has been in the meeting. He stood up, told everybody to trust the Lord. He went back to his tent. He's crying out to the Lord. And then, verse 15, the Lord says to Moses, why are you crying out? Do this, do that. And then verse 19, then the angel of God who had been traveling in front of the army withdrew and went behind them. Verse 21, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea so that all night long, so on and so forth. So those thens really describe simultaneous events. It tells you about each portion of the event, but they all happen pretty close to each other. And then the whole event takes place over about 2 days. Now, let me just point you to the chart. We'll take a look at this. I've shown this as 2 days. For simplicity, the sun rises at 6 in the morning and it sets at 6 in the evening. The black portion here is nighttime. Sunrise in the morning, jump down here to the morning of the second day. then it's light for 12 hours, and then it's dark for 12 hours, okay? And that gives us an idea how this might have happened. Now, let's start out 8 o'clock in the morning. Pharaoh and his army arrive, and they start pouring out, setting up camp, preparing for the attack. That's verse 10. And this is going to last all day. This takes a long time for hundreds of thousands of soldiers and chariots and horses and supplies and all the things that go with an army to get in there, set up their camp, and get ready. And it's designed, of course, to produce the maximum amount of terror. The camp is in chaos all during this time. And let's say about 2 o'clock, Pharaoh's got his tent set up. He's all in the command post, and he sends some emissaries, and they give the ultimatum to Moses. Within the hour, there's an emergency meeting of the tribal council of leaders, and they have to meet to address the ultimatum. The meeting's in an uproar, loud, passionate arguments in favor of surrender. That's all verse 11. And so that's this here. Let's say it lasted an hour, hour and a half. Could have been longer. At last, Moses rises to speak, right? At the very end here, and he carries the day. But he's concerned, and so he goes back to his tent, and right here, for a couple, 3 hours, he's on his face praying and begging God to help out. We need something, do something. Now, God responds, and that's these 3 verses, the thens, 15, 19, and 21. Here's what he does. First of all, the angel of the Lord goes between the parties, right here. God responds by sending that angel and puts the Egyptians on hold, okay? So they're in darkness, in the fog. They can't do anything. Then the Israelites have light during the daytime. They also at nighttime will have the light from the pillar of fire, and that provides that they need time to get ready. And so all during this time, they are preparing to break camp, and in an organized fashion, they're going to march through this opening, okay? Moses raises his hand, same time. He parts the sea. And there's a great wind. It says an east wind in one or two translations, but it's the same word that's used in Job when it speaks of the voice out of the whirlwind, like a tornado. I don't think that the wind was what actually put these 2 walls of water. That's kind of pretty hard to do. But I think that what happened is the water separated. These whirlwinds, or this whirlwind, went down into that channel, and it helped dry it out and make it ready and firm for the Israelites to pass over. Okay, let's get to the next one. Now, this is going on all night. It says that all night long, the whirlwind or the east wind, whatever it was, blew on this channel that was opened up, and the Israelites were preparing to go through. So it took quite a while, okay? And they're getting everything lined up and packed up and ready to go. About say 7:30 in the morning, the wind dies down. Now, the Egyptians are still in the dark. They're still under that cloud, and Israel begins the crossing. First ranks go in at 8 o'clock. And we said it's going to take 8 hours for the entire train to pass. So by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the camp is empty. And the last block enters the water. Then about 6 p.m., 10 hours after the first ranks went into the sea, they reached the other side, 10 miles away. So at 6 p.m., the first rank is arrived at Freedom in Midian on the opposite shore. And so the crossing continues now in the darkness all the way till 2 in the morning, when Israel's last cohort finally steps up on the land and out of the sea. And they arrive in Midian. That's what this picture is, by the way. You know, I look for imagery that helps understand. There's so much junk out there, it blows my mind. They show this little narrow passage where, 10 people can pass abreast, and it doesn't really make sense to me. But this is Tim Mahoney's movie, and I'm sure that's the one that's going to be shown in the next few weeks. It shows it from the standpoint of Midian. These people are walking toward you. This is the last of the cohort of Israel coming out of the passageway. And the cloud with the fire on the Israelite side providing light, and darkness on the other side is still back at the entrance point over on the western side. Okay? So They arrive at this point right here, and that cloud leaves its present position and it comes and repositions itself in front of Israel on the way to the mountain of God. So at that moment, the sky clears, the fog lifts from the Egyptian standpoint, and they look at the beach, and lo and behold, nobody's there. They're gone. And they see this opening in the sea, which at the shore is only, the water is only a few inches or a few feet deep. And so here's what happens next, 23 to 28.
The Egyptians pursued them, and all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so they had difficulty driving. The Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back into place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived.
Wow. So here we are. The Israelites have finally made it. The angel in the cloud, it repositions and opens up the visual field for the Egyptians. They can see the camp's empty. They see this road going into the water. It doesn't look very deep to them. And so they start marching down that road. Problem is, put yourself in their shoes. They're going down, they're marching at the good, double time or something like that, and they're going down into the water, and this wall of water gets higher, and then it gets higher, and pretty soon it's over their heads, and then it's higher than the tallest buildings, and then it's up like the highest pyramid, and they're beginning to feel confined, and they're all kind of awestruck. And not only awestruck, they must be fearful because they know this is God's work. This is the God that killed the firstborn of the entire nation. This is a bit scary. And so they're working their way from this moment here, which is about 2 in the morning, till let's say 5:30 or so, or 4:30, and they're down in the bottom. That's about how fast they would make it, and they're in the bottom of the seabed. And God calls the wheels to fall off, the chariots, and everything to start breaking up. Well, now these people who are looking at this water, knowing that this is something to be afraid of, now they see these things, everything falls apart, and they say, "We're in trouble. Their God is working and fighting for them. We need to get out of here." And so they turn around and they start running back toward the shore of on the west. Now, just for a minute, think about this. Pharaoh's chariot's broke, right? It's shot. And he is running like a scared rabbit, no more or less scared than the lowliest private infantryman in his army. He's just one of so many human beings who are ants in the sight of God. God humbled him in the plagues when he took the firstborn of the highest Pharaoh, just like he took the firstborn of the lowliest maid at the mill. And he's humbled him again by taking away all his trappings, putting him in abject fear, and making him run for his life right alongside all his soldiers. And they're headed to the west. Then, right about daybreak, it says, right about daybreak, God tells Moses, "Stretch out your hand and the waters will come back." And there's something you may not have noticed. I didn't notice this until this time. And it says in verse 27, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. At daybreak, the sea went back in its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. So what that says to me is that they were heading west. God caused the sea to collapse from west to east so that the waters were coming right at them and they could see what was coming. and they would have stopped in abject horror. And that would have then destroyed them all and would have pushed them back up toward the other side, toward the eastern shore. And that is why the next day, you'll see in verse 30, it says Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. Now that all fits, doesn't it? It gives you a feeling of how amazing this act of God was. And that's why I like this picture. It's the only one I could find that gives even an inkling of how large that opening would have been and where the cloud was and how many people are. It really gives you an understanding of the greatness of God's deed here. Now, interesting thing, Dr. Leonhard Muller from the Karolinska Institute in Sweden is an amateur archaeologist, and he's very interested in this. And many years ago, he actually commissioned or led a small expedition down into the Gulf to do some underwater mapping, and they had some underwater cameras that were used. And they got 1 or 2 kilometers from the western shore and from the eastern shore, and they took some of these pictures. Now, let me just explain these. First of all, these are coral formations. Okay, and coral does not grow just on sand. I mean, if you go swimming in a lot of the Caribbean or under off the coast of Jacksonville, where there's no structure, you don't see a lot of coral. Coral has to have something to grow on. So fishermen they'll throw an old refrigerator into the water, and then the coral will grow on that. Now, in the case of some things, coral will grow on this structure, and eventually over the years, the structure will dissolve, but the coral still remains and provides its own structure, and that's how it continues to grow. And so it will take on the shape of the structure that it grew on in the first place. That's my point. And so you can imagine maybe some of these things give you the idea of chariot wheels and the wreckage on the floor of the ocean there. There's an axle, there's a wheel. Here's somebody who's superimposed his idea of what this might have been. It's sort of the spokes of a wheel. I don't know, but it certainly looks plausible to me, and it's pretty interesting. Now, nobody knows really what's at the bottom of the deeper sections unless the U.S. Navy does, but it would be really interesting if any of you have enough money to go down there and take a good look. So there's evidence that this may well have been the site where this occurred. Okay, it's a great story. The story makes sense. It did last 2 days, and this is absolutely wonderful, but what's the takeaway? And you always have to ask that question. We're a Sunday school class, and we're trying to study the Bible for our own reasons. And you always remember, when you study God's word, you should ask yourself a couple questions, the same questions. What does this tell me about God? What does this tell me about us, about me? Okay. What does this tell me to avoid, and what does this tell me to do? I want to focus on the first 2 of those questions and ask them. What does this tell me? What truths does it tell me about God? Well, first of all, it tells me that God is involved with his world. God is not the God of the deist. He's not the God of the pantheist. He's not the God who is not actively working and doing things in his world. His world was set up according to largely immutable physical laws, but he is the one who made the laws, and he can abrogate them at any time. He also can work within the physical laws of his world, and he can be active and do things, and he does. In this case, God is involved with the Israelites, and he cares about them. You remember back in chapter 3 and chapter 6, God gives the reasons why he's sending Moses. And he says, I have seen their suffering. I have heard their cries. I have taken notice, or I care about them. I remember my promises, and I am coming to rescue them. That is not an uninterested God. That is a God who is very actively involved within his creation. Secondly, it tells us that God is supreme over all earthly power. And you see this when you try to imagine Pharaoh with his chariot falling. He's now in the mud, in the dirt, and he is scrambling to get back alongside of all the other soldiers who were climbing over him. There's nothing special about him. This guy is not a god. His person is no longer sacred. It's everybody for himself. And in the sight of God, there's so many ants. I love Psalm 2 because it really gives you this understanding. It says, why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let's break their chains and throw off their shackles. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger, and he terrifies them in his wrath. The spirit of our age, as we can see it developing with some fear and trepidation, is this spirit, let us break God's chains. Let us throw off his shackles. We have got no use for your old morality. We have no use for your values. We have no use for your statement of creation, how we were created, and what our nature is. We are trying to say today that black is white and white is black, and male is female and female is male, and marriage is something other than what God created it to be. And we are going to do everything we can to throw off our shackles, just like we banished the 10 Commandments from the schoolroom. We want to banish God from our culture. And God, enthroned in heaven, laughs. He scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger, and he terrifies them in his wrath. God will do what he promises. He will do what he will do. Len often quotes that verse in Numbers, God is not a man that he should lie, and nor the son of man that he should not tell the truth. He will do what he will do. And we need not be afraid that the forces that we see amassing on the horizon are going to be insurmountable or will win the day in any sense. Al Mohler just wrote a book called The Gathering Storm, which harks back to the days in the 1930s when Winston Churchill was warning against the storm that was coming that turned out to be World War II. And it feels very much like we're in a gathering storm, but we need not be afraid because God is supreme over all earthly power. Many of us are really kind of wrapped up in politics, maybe more than we should be. But thank God for good men in politics. Thank God for godly women who serve in a community. But our faith is not in them. Our faith is not in the next election, whatever comes to pass. Our faith is in the God who is supreme over all earthly power. Thirdly, God will place himself between his enemies and his people when it's necessary. And so we may be seeing a gathering storm, and we may see that there's a threat to us in so many ways, but ultimately, God places himself in between us and his enemies. He will provide a space. He will provide a way out. And even death itself is a way out into glory in heaven. In the great German hymn from Martin Luther, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," it says, "Let goods and kindred go, this mortal life also. His rage," speaking of Satan's rage, "we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure." God will place himself between his enemies and his people. Fourthly, God is unconventional. He doesn't do it the way we think he's going to do it. He says to Moses, turn back. You're not going the way you plan. I want you to go south. I want you to get trapped. I want you to go onto this beach where you can't possibly escape. I'm going to put you in an impossible situation on the beach. And the reason he does that is he says, my strength is made perfect in weakness. In 1 Corinthians 1, he says, but God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. He chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. And he doesn't always tell us how he's going to do it. So don't be surprised if God doesn't reveal to you the whole game plan. Especially you young people. I think most of the older folks that are listening here would be able to tell you that life did not turn out at all like their detailed and wonderful plans were when they were 18 years old. Let God lead you step by step. He doesn't have to tell you what's going to happen next year or next decade. He simply tells you what to do today. Find the good works that he has already prepared for you to walk in and walk in them. Fifthly, God is most glorified when he delivers us from the impossible places. God will put you on Nueva Beach at least once in your life, because it brings him all the glory and it reveals to you and me who he truly is. We need to know something about who God truly is, or we cannot possibly worship him. And he loves to reveal himself by doing these things that are impossible. I think we should pray often, Lord, do in me and through me things that cannot be explained or understood in any way other than your power, your glory, and your activity in my life. He is most glorified when he delivers us from the impossible places on the beach. And then sixth, God will ultimately destroy his enemies. You know, you look at it, the Lord treated Pharaoh like a cat treats a mouse. He pushed him in one way and then the other way. He hardened his heart. He said, I will gain glory through Pharaoh. He's nobody special. All for his own purposes, because Pharaoh was his enemy. But in the very last, he did totally destroy him. And we need to remember that. I think it's something we don't think about or preach about enough. Hebrews 9:27 says, it is appointed unto man once to die, but after this, the judgment. And there is a judgment coming. And we ought to be deeply concerned about that because it will determine an eternal state. Eternal death, which is separation from life and from God, or eternal life in heaven with him. We had better get that right. And we better be concerned about it because God will ultimately destroy his enemies. Now, the other thing is, what does it tell us about us? And it tells me only one thing. Faith comes so hard. It is just not easy to trust God, is it? In spite of all the miracles they had just experienced back in Egypt, they still turned on Moses. And we'll see this again and again and again. Moses provides manna in the wilderness, and they turn on Moses and they say, what'd you do? You bring us out here to die with this manna. Why don't you give us meat? You know, it goes on and on and on. And we are unfortunately the same thing. Like the disciples in the boat. Jesus is asleep. And they say, wake up, wake up. Don't you know what's happening? God doesn't know what's happening. Don't you care about us? God doesn't care about them. He's in the boat with them. And yet they still warranted Jesus' claim where he says, you of little faith. And we are of little faith. It gets rough and we immediately start crying, oh God, how could you do this to me? Where are you? What are you going to do? Fix this. And we don't trust him and we don't rest in him. And we don't have that peace that we need to have that comes from trusting him. And in spite of all the good that we know and the things we've gone through, we still worry, we fret, we question his goodness, and we try to take the wheel from his hand. And that makes me think of Carrie Underwood, Jesus Take the Wheel. I never cared for that song that much, but it's interesting. One very important thing about that is that she doesn't say Jesus takes the wheel. She's in the middle of the crash. And why do we wait till we're in the middle of the crash to let Jesus take the wheel? I'm telling you, if we'd let him take the wheel earlier, we would be in less crashes. Sometimes it takes a crash for him to get the wheel out of our hands. Now, there's one other thing, something interesting. Is that the idea of remembrance? John, let's read verses 30 and 31. Finish out the chapter.
That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant.
Back around 1967, after the 67 Six-Day War that Israel had, they, of course, took control of the Sinai. And they discovered this pillar in the water off the beach, laying on its side. It's 3 feet in diameter, and it's 15 feet high. And it's made of granite that is not native to the area. It's actually very similar to pillars like this that were memorials erected up in the land of Canaan, in Ashkelon in particular. There were inscriptions on it at one time, but they're all worn away, so you can't read them anymore. But I wonder if maybe during Solomon's reign or during the reign of the judges or sometime immediately after they got there, somebody said, we need to memorialize this event. We need to tell our children and our children's children that this happened. There is apparently, some would say that there was a similar or identical pillar on the other side, on the Arab side, but the Saudis have removed it and replaced it with this marker. I'm a little skeptical about that, but that may be so as well. And they would have raised a pillar on one end and a pillar on the other. So this is where God saved us. It makes you think of Joshua 4, where Joshua's got the people in Gilgal and they're getting ready to cross the Jordan at flood stage and then go up and attack Jericho and take possession of the land. And he says, it says in verses 20 to 24, Joshua set up at Gilgal the 12 stones that they had taken out of the Jordan. And he said to the Israelites, in the future, when your descendants ask their parents, what do these stones mean? Tell them, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea, when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. Here he's referencing again this amazing event. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, that you might always fear the Lord your God. God does these things in our life and in history that we may know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, that he can be trusted, that in the words of the child's prayer, God is great and God is good, and that you might always fear the Lord your God. And for those who didn't experience it, they erected pillars to remind their children and their children's children what God had done. And so I just leave you with one little question. Have you set up any pillars in your life?